Driver's license terminated after laughing at veteran. Judge Caprio's legendary ruling today. The December morning arrived in Providence, Rhode Island, with the kind of crisp clarity that made the city's historic architecture seem to glow against the winter sky. Fresh snow from the previous evening had dusted the courthouse steps with a pristine white coating that sparkled in the early sunlight, creating an almost magical atmosphere around the building where justice had been administered, with compassion for generations. Inside the Providence Municipal Court, the familiar warmth of the heating system mixed with the scent of old wood and leather-bound law books, creating the comforting atmosphere that had welcomed countless citizens seeking resolution to their legal matters. Judge Frank Caprio arrived at his chambers at precisely 7:30, as had been his unwavering custom for over 3 decades of distinguished service. At 79 years old, he moved with the graceful deliberation of a man who understood that every moment in his courtroom carried the potential to change lives, to teach lessons, and to demonstrate the finest qualities of American justice. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his black judicial robe hung with the dignity earned through decades of fair and compassionate service, and his warm brown eyes already carried the gentle sparkle that had made him beloved not just in Rhode Island, but across the entire nation. The judge's morning routine was both methodical and meditative, reflecting his deep respect for the responsibility that had been entrusted to him. He began each day by reviewing the cases scheduled to appear before him, but his review went far beyond the simple legal facts and statutory requirements. Judge Caprio sought to understand the human stories behind each citation, each violation, each appearance in his courtroom. This approach had earned him a reputation that extended far beyond the boundaries of Rhode Island. He was known as the judge who saw people rather than just cases, who understood that behind every legal proceeding was a human being deserving of dignity, respect, and the possibility of redemption. As he settled into his leather chair, surrounded by the law books that had been his constant companions throughout his career, Judge Caprio opened the file for what appeared to be a routine traffic case. The defendant was listed as Derek Morrison, a 28-year-old man cited for speeding in a school zone during afternoon dismissal hours. The violation itself was straightforward: driving 38 miles per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour school zone, a clear violation that endangered the safety of children and warranted serious attention. What made this case potentially more complex was a note attached to the file indicating that Morrison had requested to present evidence and testimony in his defense. Such requests were not uncommon in Judge Caprio's courtroom, where defendants were always given the opportunity to explain their circumstances and present their side of the story. The judge's philosophy had always been that understanding the context of someone's actions was essential to administering true justice, justice that served not just the letter of the law, but its spirit and purpose. Judge Caprio's preparation for each case was legendary among courthouse staff for its thoroughness and compassion. He didn't simply review the legal requirements and precedents. He considered the human elements that might have contributed to each situation. Had the defendant been facing a family emergency? Were there financial hardships that might have influenced their behavior? Was this an isolated incident or part of a pattern? These questions guided his approach to every case, ensuring that justice was administered with both firmness and understanding. The morning's docket included 18 cases, a typical load for a Tuesday in December. Judge Caprio reviewed each one with the same careful attention, from simple parking violations to more serious moving violations. His approach remained consistent regardless of the severity of the charge. Every person who appeared before him deserved the full measure of his attention, respect, and consideration. This philosophy had made his courtroom a place where people felt heard, understood, and treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances or background. As he prepared for the day's proceedings, Judge Caprio reflected on the broader purpose of his work. Traffic court might seem mundane to some, but he understood that these interactions often represented people's only direct contact with the judicial system. How they were treated in his courtroom would shape their perception of American justice. For years to come, every case was an opportunity to demonstrate the values that made the American system of justice worthy of respect: fairness, compassion, accountability, and the recognition of human dignity. The courthouse staff began their own preparations, each member of the team understanding their role in creating an environment where justice could be administered effectively and compassionately. Officer Martinez, the bailiff who had worked with Judge Caprio for over a decade, conducted his routine security check while mentally preparing for another day of witnessing the judge's legendary ability to balance firmness with kindness. The court clerk, Mrs. Patterson, organized the day's files with meticulous care, knowing that every detail might prove important in Judge Caprio's thorough consideration of each case. At 8:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled start of proceedings, the courtroom began to fill with the day's defendants and their families. The atmosphere was typical of Judge Caprio's courtroom, nervous but not hostile, tense but tempered with hope. Word of the judge's reputation for fairness and compassion had spread throughout Rhode Island and beyond, and many people who appeared before him came with expectations of being treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the charges they faced. Among those entering the courtroom was Derek Morrison, the defendant in the school zone speeding case. Morrison carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his expensive suit and designer accessories suggesting someone accustomed to getting his way through wealth and influence rather than humility and respect. His demeanor stood in stark contrast to the typically contrite bearing of most defendants, and several courthouse veterans noticed his apparent lack of concern about the proceedings he was about to face. What Morrison and the other early arrivals could not have known was that they were about to witness one of the most profound demonstrations of judicial wisdom and human compassion in Judge Caprio's long and distinguished career. The seemingly routine traffic case was about to become a defining moment that would illustrate the judge's legendary ability to transform moments of disrespect and conflict into powerful lessons about dignity, service, and the values that truly matter in American society. As the clock approached 9 o'clock, the final participants in the day's drama took their places. Among them was a man who walked slowly with the aid of a walker, his movements careful and deliberate, his bearing suggesting both physical challenges and inner strength. This was Robert Sullivan, a 73-year-old Korean War veteran who had been subpoenaed as a witness in Morrison's case. Sullivan's presence in the courtroom would prove to be the catalyst for events that no one could have anticipated. Judge Caprio entered the courtroom at precisely 9 o'clock, his presence immediately commanding the respect and attention of everyone present. As he took his place behind the bench, the familiar routine of calling the court to order began, but the atmosphere carried an unusual tension that seemed to hint at the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating a scene that would soon become a powerful demonstration of everything Judge Caprio represented: justice administered with wisdom, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity. The stage was set for a confrontation between arrogance and humility, between disrespect and honor, between those who had forgotten the meaning of service and sacrifice and those who embodied those values every day of their lives. In his decades on the bench, Judge Caprio had seen many such moments, but few would test his legendary patience and wisdom as severely as what was about to transpire in his courtroom on this December morning in Providence. Judge Caprio called the court to order, with his characteristic warmth and dignity, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had made him a beloved figure throughout Rhode Island and far beyond. The courtroom settled into the familiar rhythm of morning proceedings, with the usual mixture of nervous defendants, concerned family members, and courthouse regulars who had come to witness the legendary compassion and wisdom of America's most famous traffic court judge. The first few cases proceeded exactly as expected in Judge Caprio's courtroom. A college student who had parked illegally while rushing to visit his hospitalized grandmother received a suspended fine and words of encouragement. An elderly woman who had run a stop sign due to confusion about new traffic patterns was gently educated about road safety and given a reduced penalty with the requirement to attend a brief refresher course. Each case demonstrated the judge's extraordinary ability to balance accountability with compassion, ensuring that justice served not just punishment, but education and the possibility of growth. As the morning progressed, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained warm and respectful, reflecting the tone that Judge Caprio had established through decades of treating every person who appeared before him with dignity and understanding. Spectators often remarked that his courtroom felt more like a place of healing than punishment, where people left feeling better about themselves and their relationship with the justice system rather than bitter or resentful. The case of Derek. Morrison was called shortly after 10:30, and Morrison approached the defendant's table with a swagger that immediately caught the attention of courthouse veterans. His expensive suit, designer watch, and carefully styled appearance suggested someone who was accustomed to using wealth and status to navigate life's challenges rather than accepting responsibility and showing appropriate respect for legal proceedings. Everything about his demeanor conveyed a sense of entitlement and barely concealed disdain for the process he was being required to endure. Judge Caprio reviewed Morrison's file one final time before addressing the defendant. "Mr. Morrison, you are charged with exceeding the speed limit in a school zone, specifically traveling 38 miles per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour zone during student dismissal hours. This is a serious violation that endangers the safety of children. How do you plead to this charge?" Morrison's response was delivered with the kind of practiced confidence that suggested he had never doubted his ability to talk his way out of any situation. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I believe there are circumstances that will explain and justify my driving on that particular afternoon." Judge Caprio nodded with his characteristic patience. "Very well, Mr. Morrison. Please tell the court what happened on the afternoon in question." Morrison launched into what was clearly a prepared explanation, his tone suggesting that he viewed the entire proceeding as an unnecessary inconvenience. "Your Honor, I was driving through that area on my way to an important business meeting. I was not aware that it was a school zone, and I certainly wasn't aware of any reduced speed limits. The signage in that area is inadequate, and I believe any reasonable driver might have made the same mistake." The explanation was delivered with such casual dismissiveness that it seemed to ignore the fundamental purpose of school zone speed limits, protecting children's lives. Judge Caprio listened patiently, but those who knew him well could detect the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated his growing concern about Morrison's attitude. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Caprio responded gently, "the school zone signs are clearly posted and meet all state and federal requirements for visibility and placement. Additionally, the reduced speed limit was in effect during designated school hours when children were present. Can you tell me why you didn't notice these signs or the presence of children in the area?" Morrison's answer revealed the depth of his self-absorption. "Your Honor, I was focused on my business call and preparing for my meeting. I employ several people, and my time is extremely valuable. I can't be expected to constantly monitor every minor traffic sign. when I have important business matters to handle." The response drew a few sharp intakes of breath from the gallery, where parents and community members recognized the dangerous attitude being displayed. The idea that business concerns could justify endangering children's safety struck many as both callous and irresponsible. Judge Caprio maintained his composure, but his expression had grown more serious. "Mr. Morrison, the safety of children must always take precedence over business concerns. When you choose to drive in a community, you accept the responsibility to follow traffic laws designed to protect all citizens, especially the most vulnerable." "Your Honor," Morrison replied with growing irritation, "I understand the theoretical importance of these regulations, but in practical terms I was driving safely and posed no real danger to anyone. This citation represents government overreach and an unnecessary interference with productive citizens trying to conduct legitimate business." The dismissive tone and apparent lack of genuine concern for child safety was beginning to create a tension in the courtroom that even casual observers could feel. Judge Caprio had encountered many defendants over the years who initially failed to grasp the seriousness of their actions, but Morrison's attitude suggested something deeper, a fundamental disconnect from the values of community responsibility and mutual respect that formed the foundation of civil society. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Caprio said, his voice still gentle but carrying increased gravity, "the court has a witness who observed your driving on that afternoon. Officer Martinez, please ask Mr. Sullivan to come forward." Robert Sullivan rose slowly from his seat in the gallery, his movements careful and deliberate as he made his way toward the witness stand with the aid of his walker. At 73 years old, Sullivan carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced life's challenges with courage and determination. His appearance, neat but simple clothing, an American Legion pin on his jacket lapel, and the measured gait of someone managing physical limitations with grace, immediately commanded respect from everyone in the courtroom except, apparently, Derek Morrison. As Sullivan made his way slowly toward the front of the courtroom, Morrison's reaction was both immediate and shocking. He began to chuckle, quietly at first, but with increasing audibility. His amusement seemed to be directed at Sullivan's careful movement with the walker, and his expression suggested that he found something inherently funny about the elderly man's physical limitations. The chuckling grew more obvious as Sullivan reached the witness stand and carefully positioned his walker before taking his seat. Morrison's behavior had progressed from quiet amusement to barely suppressed laughter, and his attitude was becoming impossible to ignore. Several spectators turned to stare at Morrison in disbelief, unable to comprehend how anyone could find humor in an elderly person's mobility challenges. Judge Caprio observed Morrison's behavior with growing alarm and disappointment. In his 3 decades on the bench, he had encountered many forms of disrespect and inappropriate behavior, but rarely had he witnessed such callous mockery of someone's physical limitations, especially in his courtroom, where dignity and respect were fundamental principles. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying a warning tone that courthouse veterans recognized as the precursor to more serious consequences. "Is there something about these proceedings that you find amusing?" Morrison attempted to compose himself, but his attitude remained dismissive. "I apologize, Your Honor. I just found it somewhat ironic that someone who clearly has difficulty getting around is being called as a witness in a case about traffic safety and efficiency." The comment hit the courtroom like a physical blow. The casual cruelty of Morrison's words, the complete lack of empathy for another human being's challenges, and the arrogant assumption that physical limitations somehow diminished a person's worth or credibility created a moment of stunned silence that seemed to stretch forever. Judge Caprio felt his own breathing deepen as he processed what he had just witnessed. This wasn't simply about a traffic violation anymore. This was about fundamental human values, about respect for those who had served their country, about the basic decency that should govern how people treat one another in a civilized society. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Caprio said, his voice gentle and respectful as he addressed the witness, "please state your name and occupation for the record." Sullivan answered with quiet dignity, his voice steady despite the humiliation he had just endured. "Robert Sullivan, Your Honor. I'm retired, but I served in the United States Army during the Korean War." The simple statement carried enormous weight in the suddenly silent courtroom. Here was a man who had served his country with honor, who had sacrificed his youth and ultimately his physical well-being in defense of American values, being mocked by someone who seemed to embody everything those values stood against. Morrison's reaction to learning of Sullivan's military service was telling. Instead of showing appropriate respect or embarrassment for his previous behavior, he seemed to grow even more dismissive, as if Sullivan's service was irrelevant to his own convenience and interests. Judge Caprio looked out over his courtroom, seeing the faces of citizens who had come seeking justice and witnessing instead a display of casual cruelty that challenged everything he believed about human dignity and mutual respect. The stage was set for a moment that would test not just Morrison's character, but Judge Caprio's legendary ability to transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for education, growth, and the affirmation of fundamental human values. The morning sun continued to stream through the courthouse windows, but the atmosphere had grown heavy with tension and the weight of choices that would define not just the outcome of this case, but the very meaning of respect, honor, and justice in American society. The revelation of Robert Sullivan's military service created a profound shift in the courtroom atmosphere, but Derek Morrison's reaction to this information proved even more shocking than his initial display of callous humor. Instead of showing the respect and contrition that most people would demonstrate upon learning they had mocked a war veteran, Morrison's expression suggested annoyance rather than shame, as if Sullivan's service record was an inconvenient detail that complicated his preferred narrative of the day's events. Judge Caprio observed Morrison's continued lack of appropriate response with growing concern and disappointment. In his decades of service, he had witnessed many moments when defendants realized the gravity of their situation and chose to demonstrate genuine remorse and respect. Morrison's failure to recognize the significance of Sullivan's sacrifice represented something deeper than simple rudeness. It suggested a fundamental disconnect from the values of service, sacrifice, and mutual respect that formed the foundation of American democracy. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Caprio continued, his voice carrying the warmth and respect that had made him beloved throughout Rhode Island, "can you tell the court what you observed on the afternoon in question?" Sullivan adjusted his position slightly, his movements careful but dignified as he prepared to provide his testimony. "Your Honor, I was walking home from my physical therapy appointment at the VA Medical Center. I use this route because it's flat and well-maintained, which makes it easier for me to navigate with my walker." Morrison's reaction to Sullivan's mention of physical therapy was immediate and appalling. He barely suppressed another chuckle, his expression suggesting that he found something inherently amusing about the veteran's need for medical treatment. The behavior was so inappropriate and shocking that several spectators in the gallery audibly gasped, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Judge Caprio's eyes flashed with a combination of anger and disappointment that courthouse veterans had rarely seen in their decades of observing his legendary patience and compassion. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, "I need you to understand something very clearly. Mr. Sullivan is a veteran who served our country with honor and distinction. His need for physical therapy is a direct result of injuries sustained in service to America. Your behavior toward him is not only inappropriate, it is deeply offensive to everything this courtroom and this country stand for." Morrison's response revealed the depth of his arrogance and disconnect from basic human decency. "Your Honor, I understand that military service is admirable, but I don't see how Mr. Sullivan's personal history is relevant to a simple traffic violation. I'm here to address a legal matter, not to participate in some kind of patriotic ceremony." The comment created another moment of stunned silence in the courtroom. Morrison had not only failed to show appropriate respect for Sullivan's service, but had actively dismissed it as irrelevant to the proceedings. His attitude suggested someone who had never understood the sacrifices made by others to preserve the freedoms he took for granted. Judge Caprio felt his own composure being tested in ways that rarely occurred in his courtroom. This wasn't simply about legal procedure or traffic safety anymore. This was about fundamental human values and the respect owed to those who had sacrificed for their country. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable gravity, "Mr. Sullivan's service is relevant because it demonstrates the kind of character and sacrifice that built this nation. Your dismissive attitude toward that service raises serious questions about your own character and values." Sullivan, meanwhile, continued his testimony with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life. "Your Honor, I was crossing the intersection when I observed Mr. Morrison's vehicle approaching at a high rate of speed. There were children present. Several students were still leaving the school grounds, and some parents were walking with younger children." "And what specifically did you observe about Mr. Morrison's driving behavior?" Judge Caprio asked. "He was clearly exceeding the speed limit, Your Honor, but what concerned me most was that he seemed completely oblivious to the presence of children in the area. He was talking on his phone and appeared to be paying no attention to his surroundings." Morrison interrupted Sullivan's testimony with obvious irritation. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly biased against me. He's making assumptions about my attention and awareness based on his limited perspective from the sidewalk." The interruption was both procedurally inappropriate and personally disrespectful, cutting off a war veteran's testimony with the kind of casual dismissiveness that would have been shocking in any courtroom, but was particularly egregious in Judge Caprio's domain of respect and dignity. Judge Caprio's response was measured but firm. "Mr. Morrison, you will not interrupt witness testimony in this courtroom. Mr. Sullivan has every right to complete his statement without interference." Sullivan continued with unshakable composure. "What troubled me most, Your Honor, was that when Mr. Morrison realized he had been observed speeding, his reaction was not concern for the children's safety, but anger at being caught. He rolled down his window and made several inappropriate comments before driving away." "What kind of comments did Mr. Morrison make?" Judge Caprio asked. Sullivan hesitated slightly, clearly reluctant to repeat offensive language in the dignified setting of the courtroom. "He used profanity, Your Honor, and made comments about people needing to mind their own business instead of interfering with his important activities." Morrison's face flushed with anger rather than embarrassment. "Your Honor, I may have been frustrated by this man's interference, but I was conducting legitimate business and had every right to express my displeasure at his inappropriate surveillance of my activities." The response revealed Morrison's complete inability to understand that his behavior was the problem, not Sullivan's appropriate concern for public safety. His characterization of a citizen's legitimate concern about reckless driving as inappropriate surveillance suggested someone who viewed himself as above normal standards of accountability and community responsibility. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting the deep thought and consideration that had characterized his approach to difficult cases throughout his career. "Mr. Morrison, let me make sure I understand your position correctly. You were speeding in a school zone, endangering children's safety, and when a concerned citizen observed your behavior, you responded with profanity and anger rather than acknowledging your error and modifying your conduct. Your Honor, Morrison replied with growing defiance, I was driving in a manner appropriate to my needs and circumstances. This gentleman, he gestured dismissively towards Sullivan, chose to involve himself in matters that were none of his concern. The continued disrespect towards Sullivan, combined with Morrison's complete failure to accept responsibility for endangering children, created a moment of crystalline clarity for Judge Caprio. This case had evolved far beyond a simple traffic violation into a fundamental test of values, character, and the principles that governed civilized society. Mr. Morrison, Judge Caprio said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of judicial experience, your attitude toward Mr. Sullivan and your dismissal of legitimate safety concerns suggest a level of callousness and self-absorption that this court finds deeply troubling. But I want to give you one more opportunity to demonstrate appropriate respect and understanding. Morrison's response would prove to be the defining moment of the entire proceeding. Instead of recognizing the gravity of his situation and the opportunity for redemption that Judge Caprio was offering, he doubled down on his dismissive attitude. Your Honor, I appreciate your position, but I think we're losing sight of the real issue here. I'm a productive member of society who creates jobs and contributes to the economy. My time is valuable, and these proceedings are costing me significant money. While I respect this gentleman's military service, he gestured again toward Sullivan with obvious insincerity. I don't think his personal situation should override practical considerations of efficiency and common sense. The statement was breathtaking in its combination of arrogance, insensitivity, and fundamental misunderstanding of basic human values. Morrison had managed to dismiss Sullivan's sacrifice, minimize the importance of children's safety, and portray himself as the victim, all while maintaining his position that his personal convenience should take precedence over community welfare and legal requirements. Judge Caprio looked out over his courtroom, seeing the faces of citizens who had come seeking justice and witnessing instead a display of callousness that challenged everything he believed about human dignity and mutual respect. The moment had arrived when he would need to respond, not just as a judge interpreting traffic law, but as a guardian of the values that made American society worth preserving. The morning sun had climbed higher in the Providence sky, its light now streaming directly through the courthouse windows and illuminating what would become one of the most memorable moments in Judge Caprio's legendary career. The stage was set for a response that would demonstrate the true meaning of justice, not just punishment for wrongdoing, but the affirmation of fundamental human values in the face of callous disregard for everything that truly mattered. The profound silence that followed Derek Morrison's final statement seemed to stretch across the courtroom like a heavy curtain, muffling even the smallest sounds and creating a sense of anticipation that was almost physically palpable. Judge Caprio sat in quiet contemplation, his hands folded before him in the gesture that courthouse veterans recognized as his deepest thinking mode. In his 3 decades on the bench, he had encountered many challenging moments, but few that so clearly crystallized the fundamental conflict between selfishness and service, between arrogance and humility, between those who took America's freedoms for granted and those who had sacrificed everything to preserve them. The judge's warm brown eyes moved slowly across the courtroom, taking in the faces of the assembled citizens, some shocked by Morrison's callousness, others hopeful that justice would be served, all waiting to see how their beloved judge would respond to such an extraordinary display of disrespect and insensitivity. Robert Sullivan sat quietly in the witness chair, his dignity unshaken despite the humiliation he had endured. embodying the quiet strength that had carried him through war, recovery, and decades of service to his community. Judge Caprio's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a gravity and weight that filled every corner of the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, in my 33 years serving on this bench, I have had the privilege of presiding over thousands of cases involving citizens from every walk of life. I have seen people at their best and at their worst, in moments of triumph and moments of failure, in times when they chose to rise above their circumstances, and times when they chose to fall short of their potential. The judge paused, his gaze moving to Morrison, who stood at the defendant's table with an expression that still suggested annoyed impatience rather than any understanding of the gravity of his situation. But rarely have I encountered such a stark contrast between two individuals as I have witnessed in this courtroom today. Judge Caprio then turned his attention to Robert Sullivan, his expression warming with the respect and admiration that he felt for all veterans who had served their country with honor. Mr. Sullivan, you have served our nation with distinction, sacrificing your youth and ultimately your physical well-being in defense of the freedoms that we all enjoy. You have continued to serve your community through your advocacy for veteran affairs and your volunteer work with local schools, teaching children about the importance of civic responsibility. The judge's voice grew stronger as he continued. Today, despite facing mockery and disrespect from someone who should know better, you have conducted yourself with the same quiet dignity and strength that has characterized your entire life. You represent the very best of what America stands for: service before self, sacrifice for the common good, and the understanding that true strength comes not from what we take, but from what we give. Morrison shifted uncomfortably as Judge Caprio's attention turned to him, perhaps finally beginning to realize that this was not proceeding according to his expectations. Mr. Morrison, your behavior in this courtroom today has been nothing short of appalling. You have mocked a war veteran, dismissed legitimate safety concerns about children, and demonstrated a level of callousness and self-absorption that this court finds deeply disturbing. The judge's voice remained controlled, but carried unmistakable authority as he continued his analysis of Morrison's conduct. You came into this courtroom expecting to charm your way out of accountability through wealth, status, and verbal manipulation. When confronted with evidence of your reckless endangerment of children's safety, you showed no remorse, no concern for those you put at risk, and no understanding of your responsibilities as a member of this community. Judge Caprio leaned forward. Slightly, his eyes focused directly on Morrison. But your treatment of Mr. Sullivan represents something even more troubling than simple traffic violations or legal irresponsibility. Your mockery of a disabled war veteran reveals a fundamental character flaw that raises serious questions about your fitness to hold a driver's license and participate in our community. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as Judge Caprio prepared to render his decision. Mr. Morrison, driving is not a right. It is a privilege that comes with serious responsibilities. Those responsibilities include not just following traffic laws, but demonstrating the kind of character and judgment that make you fit to operate a potentially lethal piece of machinery in close proximity to your fellow citizens. The judge consulted his notes briefly before continuing. Your reckless driving in a school zone endangered children's lives. Your dismissive attitude toward legitimate safety concerns shows a callous disregard for community welfare. But your treatment of Mr. Sullivan demonstrates something that goes to the very heart of who you are as a person, a complete lack of respect for those who have sacrificed for your freedom. Morrison's face had grown increasingly pale as the full weight of Judge Caprio's words settled over him. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he seemed to grasp that his usual methods of avoiding consequences were not going to work in this situation. Therefore, Judge Caprio announced, his voice carrying the authority of decades of judicial experience, I am imposing the following sentence. You are guilty of speeding in a school zone, for which you will pay the maximum fine of $1,000. Additionally, your driver's license is hereby suspended for a period of 6 months. A collective gasp arose from the gallery. License suspension was an unusually severe penalty for a first-time speeding offense, but Judge Caprio was clearly addressing far more than simple traffic violations. However, the judge continued, the suspension of your driving privileges addresses only the legal aspects of this case. Your behavior toward Mr. Sullivan requires additional action that speaks to the broader issues of character and community responsibility. Judge Caprio then did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. He stood up from the bench and walked around to stand directly in front of Morrison, removing the physical barrier that typically separated the judge from the defendant. The gesture was unprecedented in his long career, but this moment called for something beyond traditional judicial protocol. Mr. Morrison, he said quietly, speaking directly to the man rather than delivering judgment from on high, I am ordering you to complete 200 hours of community service, specifically working with disabled veterans at the Providence Veterans Affairs Medical Center. You will assist with mobility therapy, help veterans navigate the facility, and most importantly, you will listen to their stories of service and sacrifice. The wisdom of this sentence began to dawn on the spectators. This wasn't just punishment. It was education, transformation, an opportunity for Morrison to understand exactly whom he had mocked and what their sacrifices had meant for his freedom to live in this country. Furthermore, Judge Caprio continued, you will attend monthly counseling sessions to address what appears to be a fundamental lack of empathy and respect for others. This counseling will continue for the full duration of your license suspension and will be a requirement for reinstatement of your driving privileges. Judge Caprio then turned to address Robert Sullivan directly. Mr. Sullivan, I want to personally apologize to you on behalf of this court and this community for the disrespect you have endured today. Your service to this nation and your dignity, in the face of such callous treatment, represent the finest qualities of American citizenship. The judge's voice carried genuine emotion as he continued, I also want to announce that this court will be making a donation of $5,000 to the Providence Veterans Affairs Medical Center in your honor, to support programs that assist disabled veterans in their ongoing recovery and rehabilitation. The announcement brought spontaneous applause from the gallery, quickly stifled as Judge Caprio raised his hand for order. But the gesture represented something important, the community's recognition of Sullivan's worth and their rejection of Morrison's values. Mr. Morrison, Judge Caprio said, returning his attention to the defendant, I want you to understand something very clearly. This sentence is not designed to destroy you or humiliate you. It is designed to educate you about values that you seem never to have learned. Respect for those who serve, concern for those who are vulnerable, and understanding of what it truly means to be a responsible member of a community. The judge's voice took on the warm, paternal tone that had made him beloved throughout Rhode Island and beyond. 6 months from now, when you return to this court to request reinstatement of your driving privileges, I hope to see a different person. I hope to see someone who has learned that true success is measured not by personal wealth or convenience, but by the respect we show others and the contributions we make to our community. Judge Caprio then addressed the broader courtroom, his voice carrying the passion that had made him a national symbol of judicial integrity. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have witnessed today is both disturbing and instructive. It is disturbing because we have seen how callousness and self-absorption can blind someone to the most basic requirements of human decency. It is instructive because it reminds us of the values that truly matter: service, sacrifice, respect for others, and the understanding that we are all part of a larger community. The judge's gaze swept across the faces in the gallery, making eye contact with spectators, court officers, and reporters. Mr. Sullivan represents everything that is good about America: the willingness to serve something larger than ourselves, the courage to sacrifice for others, and the dignity to face life's challenges with grace and strength. Mr. Morrison, at least as he appeared before us today, represents the opposite: selfishness, callousness, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be a good citizen. Judge Caprio then returned to the bench, but his tone remained personal and direct. However, I believe in the possibility of redemption. I believe that people can learn and grow and become better than they were. Mr. Morrison's sentence is designed not just to punish wrongdoing, but to create the conditions where genuine transformation becomes possible. The judge looked directly at Morrison one final time. Mr. Morrison, 6 months from now, you will have the opportunity to demonstrate whether you have learned anything from this experience. You will have worked alongside men and women who sacrificed everything for your freedom. You will have heard their stories, assisted with their rehabilitation, and hopefully gained some understanding of what true strength and character look like. Judge Caprio's voice carried both hope and challenge as he concluded, "The choice of who you become from this moment forward is entirely yours. You can continue to be the person who mocked a disabled veteran in open court, or you can become someone who understands the true meaning of service, sacrifice, and respect." The judge then made another unprecedented gesture. He asked Robert Sullivan to remain in the witness chair and requested that Morrison approach the bench. "Mr. Morrison, before you leave this courtroom, I want you to look directly at Mr. Sullivan and understand exactly whom you have wronged today." Morrison reluctantly approached, his earlier arrogance completely deflated by the weight of Judge Caprio's sentence and words. The judge continued in a voice that carried the authority of decades of experience, but also the compassion that had made him beloved. "Mr. Sullivan served in Korea when he was barely out of high school. He left his family, his girlfriend, his plans for college, and went to fight in a war that most Americans today have forgotten. He was wounded by shrapnel from a mortar attack while helping to evacuate injured soldiers from a battlefield. Those injuries have affected his mobility for over 50 years. Judge Caprio's voice grew stronger as he continued the lesson. When Mr. Sullivan returned home, there were no parades, no public recognition, no social media campaigns celebrating his service. He quietly went to work, raised a family, paid his taxes, and volunteered in his community. He has spent decades helping other veterans navigate the challenges of readjusting to civilian life, and he has worked with local schools to teach children about the importance of civic responsibility. Morrison stood frozen, perhaps finally beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his earlier behavior. Judge Caprio wasn't finished with the education he was providing. "Mr. Morrison, when you mocked Mr. Sullivan's walker, you weren't just laughing at an elderly man's mobility aid. You were mocking the lasting effects of injuries sustained in service to the very country that has provided you with the freedom to build your business, accumulate your wealth, and live your life without fear of foreign invasion or oppression." The judge paused, allowing the full weight of this reality to settle over both Morrison and the assembled courtroom. "Every step Mr. Sullivan takes with that walker is a reminder of his sacrifice for your freedom. Every struggle he faces with daily activities is a consequence of his willingness to put your welfare above his own safety." Judge Caprio then addressed the broader implications of the case. "This courtroom has always been a place where justice is administered with both firmness and compassion. but justice cannot be served when fundamental values are ignored or dismissed. Today, Mr. Morrison, you have learned that there are consequences for callousness, accountability for disrespect, and a price to be paid for forgetting the sacrifices that make our freedom possible. The judge then asked Morrison to remain standing while he addressed the courtroom community. Ladies and gentlemen, I want everyone present to understand something important. The sentence I have imposed today may seem severe for a traffic violation, but this case was never really about speeding in a school zone. This case was about character, values, and the kind of community we want to be. Judge Caprio's voice carried the passion that had made him a national figure. We live in a time when respect seems to be in short supply, when people feel free to mock those who are different or vulnerable, when personal convenience is valued more than community responsibility. Today's proceedings remind us that such attitudes are not acceptable and will not be tolerated in our community. The judge then made an announcement that surprised everyone in the courtroom. In addition to the community service and counseling requirements, Mr. Morrison will also write a formal letter of apology to Mr. Sullivan. This letter will be reviewed by the court and, if deemed sincere and appropriate, will be read at the next monthly meeting of the Providence Veterans Organization. The requirement for a public apology added another layer to Morrison's sentence, ensuring that his acknowledgement of wrongdoing would be heard by the very community he had dishonored. With his behavior, furthermore, Judge Caprio continued, Mr. Morrison's case will be monitored closely by the court. His completion of community service, his attendance at counseling sessions, and his general conduct during the suspension period will all be evaluated before any consideration of license reinstatement. Judge Caprio then turned his attention back to Robert Sullivan, his expression warming with genuine affection and respect. Mr. Sullivan, I want you to know that your dignity and grace under such difficult circumstances have reminded everyone in this courtroom of what true strength looks like. Your service to this nation and your continued service to this community are appreciated more than words can express. The judge then made one final announcement that brought tears to many eyes in the courtroom. The court will be establishing the Robert Sullivan Veterans Respect Fund, which will provide transportation assistance to disabled veterans attending medical appointments and community events. This fund will be supported by donations from court fines and fees, ensuring that your experience today contributes to something positive for other veterans. The establishment of the fund in Sullivan's honor served multiple purposes. It honored his service, addressed a real need in the veteran community, and transformed the negative experience of Morrison's disrespect into something constructive and meaningful. Judge Caprio then prepared to conclude the proceedings, but first he offered Morrison one final opportunity for redemption. Mr. Morrison, before this court is adjourned, do you have anything you would like to say to Mr. Sullivan or to this court? Morrison stood silently for a long moment, his internal struggle visible to everyone in the courtroom. The man who had entered that morning full of arrogance and dismissiveness now faced a choice between continued defiance and genuine acknowledgement of his wrongdoing. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice was barely audible and carried none of his earlier confidence. Your Honor, I want to apologize to Mr. Sullivan for my behavior. I was wrong to mock him, and I was wrong to dismiss his service. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want him to know that I understand now that I acted shamefully. The apology, while brief and clearly difficult for Morrison to deliver, represented the first genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing he had shown during the entire proceeding. Judge Caprio received it with a slight nod, recognizing it as a small but potentially significant step toward the transformation he hoped to achieve. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Caprio said gently, would you like to respond to Mr. Morrison's apology? Sullivan considered the question carefully before responding with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout the ordeal. "Your Honor, I accept Mr. Morrison's apology, and I hope that his service at the VA Medical Center will help him understand not just what veterans have sacrificed, but what we all owe to each other as fellow citizens." The grace and generosity of Sullivan's response provided a powerful contrast to Morrison's earlier behavior and demonstrated the character that had sustained him through decades of challenges and service. Judge Caprio then delivered his final remarks, his voice carrying the weight of history and the hope for a better future. "Let the record show that in the case of the state of Rhode Island versus Derek Morrison, the defendant has been found guilty of speeding in a school zone and has been sentenced to license suspension, community service, counseling, and the completion of a formal apology. But let the record also show that this case has reminded us all of the values that truly matter: respect for those who serve, concern for those who are vulnerable, and the understanding that we are all part of a larger community." As the gavel fell for the final time, the sound echoed through the courtroom with unusual resonance. The spectators remained seated for several minutes, processing what they had witnessed. Not just a legal proceeding, but a masterclass in justice, education, and the possibility of human transformation. Morrison gathered his papers with shaking hands, the weight of his sentence and its implications settling over him like a heavy cloak. As he prepared to leave the courtroom, Judge Caprio called out one final time, "Mr. Morrison, remember that Mr. Sullivan and thousands like him are the reason you have the freedom to rebuild your life and character. Don't waste the opportunity they have given you." Morrison nodded without speaking and walked slowly toward the courtroom exit, the man who left bearing little resemblance to the arrogant defendant who had entered that morning. As the courtroom began to empty, several spectators approached Robert Sullivan to thank him for his service and to express their admiration for his dignity under such trying circumstances. Sullivan accepted their gratitude with characteristic humility, more concerned with ensuring that the day's events would lead to positive changes than with receiving recognition for his own conduct. Judge Caprio remained at the bench for several minutes after the formal proceedings concluded, reflecting on one of the most challenging and meaningful cases of his long career. The confrontation between Morrison's callousness and Sullivan's dignity had crystallized everything he believed about justice, character, and the values that made American society worth preserving. 6 months after Derek Morrison's shocking display of disrespect toward Robert Sullivan in Judge Caprio's courtroom, the ripple effects of that December morning continued to spread through the Providence community and far beyond. The case had become a powerful symbol of how justice could serve not just punishment but education, transformation, and the affirmation of fundamental American values. Morrison's community service at the Providence Veterans Affairs Medical Center had proven to be exactly the transformative experience Judge Caprio had envisioned, working alongside disabled veterans, hearing their stories of service and sacrifice, and witnessing their daily courage in facing physical challenges had gradually stripped away the arrogance and callousness that had characterized his previous worldview. The man who had once mocked a war veteran's walker now spent his days helping veterans with mobility challenges, his perspective fundamentally altered by exposure to their strength and dignity. The monthly counseling sessions had also proven effective in addressing the deeper character issues that had led to Morrison's appalling behavior. His therapist had identified a pattern of entitlement and lack of empathy that stemmed from a life of privilege where he had rarely been required to consider the perspectives or needs of others. The structured exposure to veterans' experiences, combined with professional guidance, had begun to develop the empathy and respect for others that had been so obviously lacking. Perhaps most significantly, Morrison's formal letter of apology to Robert Sullivan, read at the Providence Veterans Organization monthly meeting, had been received with the same grace and forgiveness that Sullivan had shown in the courtroom. The letter, carefully crafted, over multiple drafts with input from his counselor, demonstrated genuine understanding of the harm he had caused and sincere commitment to becoming a better person. Sullivan's response, characteristically generous, had focused not on Morrison's past failures, but on his potential for positive contribution to the veteran community. The Robert Sullivan Veterans Respect Fund, established by Judge Caprio in honor of Sullivan's dignity and service, had grown beyond all expectations. Donations from throughout Rhode Island and neighboring states had poured in, allowing the fund to provide transportation assistance to hundreds of disabled veterans and to support several new programs addressing veteran needs. Sullivan himself had been appointed to the fund's advisory board, ensuring that his wisdom and experience would guide its operations. Judge Caprio's handling of the case had earned national recognition, with legal scholars and judicial experts citing it as an exemplary demonstration of how courts could address not just legal violations, but the underlying character issues that contributed to antisocial behavior. Several law schools had incorporated the case into their curricula as an example of transformative justice that served both individual rehabilitation and community healing. The enhanced traffic enforcement in school zones, sparked by Morrison's original violation, had led to measurable improvements in pedestrian safety throughout Providence. The case had reminded the community of the serious purpose behind traffic safety laws and had increased public awareness of the need to protect vulnerable road users, especially children and elderly pedestrians. Morrison's return to court for the hearing on reinstating his driving privileges had provided a striking demonstration of personal transformation. The arrogant, dismissive man who had mocked a war veteran had been replaced by someone who spoke with genuine humility about the lessons he had learned and the ongoing commitment he had made to serving the veteran community. His testimony about his experiences at the VA Medical Center had moved several spectators to tears and had convinced Judge Caprio that genuine rehabilitation had occurred. Judge Caprio's decision to reinstate Morrison's driving privileges had come with continued requirements for community service and participation in veteran support activities. The judge had recognized that Morrison's transformation, while genuine, required ongoing reinforcement through continued service to others and regular reminder of the values he had learned to embrace. The case had also had broader impacts on Rhode Island's political and social landscape. Several elected officials had cited the Morrison case when advocating for increased support for veteran services and enhanced education about military sacrifice. The stark contrast between Morrison's initial callousness and Sullivan's unwavering dignity had become a touchstone for discussions about character, service, and community responsibility. Robert Sullivan, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity, though he characteristically deflected attention from himself to focus on the needs of other veterans. His quiet dignity in the face of Morrison's mockery had inspired several community initiatives, including expanded volunteer programs at the VA Medical Center and increased participation in veteran support organizations. The media coverage of the case had extended far beyond Rhode Island, with news outlets across the country reporting on Judge Caprio's masterful handling of a situation that could have simply been resolved with a traffic fine, but instead became a powerful lesson in values, character, and the possibility of redemption. The case had been featured in documentaries about American justice, articles in legal journals, and educational materials used in schools and community organizations. Perhaps most importantly, the case had demonstrated the enduring power of Judge Caprio's approach to justice, the belief that every person who appeared before him was capable of growth, learning, and positive change. His patient questioning had revealed Morrison's character flaws. His wise sentencing had created conditions for transformation, and his compassionate follow-up had ensured that the lessons were learned and internalized. The winter morning, when Derek Morrison had laughed at a disabled war veteran, had become a defining moment, not just for the individuals involved, but for the broader community's understanding of respect, service, and the values that made American society worth preserving. Judge Caprio's legendary ruling had proven once again that justice, administered with wisdom and compassion, could transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for education, growth, and the affirmation of fundamental human dignity. The courthouse where these events had unfolded continued to serve as a beacon of hope for those seeking not just legal resolution, but genuine justice. Visitors often asked to see the courtroom where the famous Morrison case had been heard, and court staff took pride in explaining how their beloved judge had once again demonstrated that respect for veterans, concern for the vulnerable, and belief in human redemption were not just ideals, but practical principles that could guide the administration of justice. In the end, Derek Morrison's shocking disrespect toward Robert Sullivan had become the catalyst for a powerful demonstration of everything Judge Frank Caprio represented: justice tempered with mercy, accountability balanced with compassion, and the unwavering belief that even the most hardened hearts could be softened by exposure to truth, service, and the example of those who had sacrificed everything for the freedom of others. The legacy of that December morning continued to ripple outward, touching lives and inspiring changes that extended far beyond the walls of the Providence courthouse, proving once again that individual acts of courage, dignity, and wisdom could have profound and lasting impacts on entire communities and the broader cause of justice in America. Thanks for watching. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us in the comments below if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and compassion.